Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the next webinar in our Spotlight On series. Today we're focusing on developing and using assessment tools and systems so you can get the best outcomes for your students. My name's Courtney Smith. I'm an Assistant Director in the Engagement and Education Quality team and responsible for running this Spotlight series. Before we start this session, I'm just going to go through with you some housekeeping basics about how this webinar is going to work. In terms of audio, you've joined the session using your computer speaker system by default. But if you'd prefer to use your phone to listen to the webinar, you can select telephone in the audio panel of the GoToWebinar control button. And then dial-in information will be displayed. For this webinar, all participants are going to have their audio muted, so you should only be able to hear me or the panelists talking. As you can also see from the link under my name, we now offer live captioning. Today's session is going to run for about 60 minutes. I'll be welcoming our panelists shortly. But I also wanted to mention that if your colleagues can't attend this or you'd like to watch it again, we will be recording this webinar and it will be put on our website in the next couple of days. And one other last thing I wanted to mention was, because this has come up quite a few times, is that unfortunately we do not issue certificates of attendance for this webinar. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country throughout Australia and acknowledge their continuing connection to land, sea and community. I pay my respects to the people, cultures and elders, past and present emerging, and extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are in the audience today. I'm joining you from Adelaide today, so I'm on Kaurna land. Firstly, we're going to split this webinar into two segments. First, I'll give a brief run through of the Spotlight series and the topics that were covered in this series. But then we'll get to the bit that I hope is the most valuable for you, which is the question and answer session. It's your opportunity to ask questions, either of ASQA or of a vet representative, one of your peers. And a reminder about the questions. Today's topic is focused on assessment, so please ensure that any question you ask is about assessment. We won't be able to answer questions that are too specific to individual situations or not on the topic. Please also be aware that we tend to get often a couple of hundred questions in these webinars, so we will try and answer as many questions as we can. At any questions we don't get to are genuinely reviewed, and we do use them to look for broadening our guidance and answering back to them later in later work. To take part in our session and ask questions, we're going to be using Slido. You can see on the PowerPoint that there is a code for you to either log into with the photo from using your mobile, or you can use the slido.com and the event code to get through. This is the portal that allows you to submit your questions. One thing to note is that Slido does not record your details, and so questions that you receive come through as anonymous. This, of course, has many advantages, but it also means if you are wanting a follow-up on your question, we won't see who it's from. So if for a reason you do want to give your details, please include them in your question. And alternatively, if you want to speak to a certain panelist, please indicate that too. We're also going to be adding the web link for the Slido into the GoToWebinar comments field, and that you can click on that link if that's easier for you. First, I'm going to give you a brief recap on the Spotlight On series. The Spotlight On series was launched earlier this year as a resource for providers. The purpose of Spotlight On is to help providers better understand how to deliver optimum vet outcomes for your students. And Spotlight is part of ASQA's commitment to increase capability for providers to self-assure, continuously improve, provide greater clarity to the sector about how to demonstrate compliance, and importantly, elevate outcomes for students and their future employers. So at the moment, each series has been running for about 6 weeks, and we tend to conclude with an interactive Q&A webinar, like the one today, that allows our audience to talk to us as ASQA and some of our series guests, and also answer any questions the series may have raised for you, or indeed things we haven't covered yet. In series 1, we talked about trainers and assessors. We talked about the importance of having them have appropriate vet knowledge and the currency and experience. Series 2, Spotlight On, focused on assessment validation. Here, the focus was on using validation and moderation exercises to ensure your assessment tools and systems produced consistent, valid, and high-quality assessment outcomes. And Series 3 is the Spotlight On assessment, which is what we're here today to discuss. Each series has been separated into chapters covering different aspects of the subject and hopefully making it easy to reference. We've brought in videos and resources to help the messages come through, and we've taken a bit of time to translate all this information, which can be quite complex, into something a bit more user-friendly, and hopefully you're finding it entertaining and valuable. If you missed the Spotlight series or you want to reread it again at any time, you can go back and find the series on our website. It's either on the Spotlight in the search bar, or you can find it under the RTO section, or even just straight from a link on the homepage. Series 3 of Spotlight On focuses on ensuring you have a high-performing assessment system in place. We know that assessment is often talked about, and we wanted to make this series something different. So we targeted specific elements of assessment and used interviews with representatives of training providers, including one of our panelists today. And the focus was on hearing real-life examples from peers on how they approach certain challenges and what's worked really well for them in terms of getting great outcomes. The first chapter in the series, though, was a brief summary of some of the resources already available to you. Chapter 2, the interview focused on developing assessment tools that align with the training package to get your students workplace ready. Chapter 3 was about the validation of assessment tools and how using them, doing them as a pre-exercise really helps you make sure your tools are suitable for both students and industry. Chapter 4 was about supporting students. Students are at the centre of the assessment process. So this interview focused on what kind of things you can do to make sure that students are getting the best out of assessments. Chapter 5 was about delivering assessment online. I know for a lot of us, we've been forced into very unusual circumstances thanks to COVID. And for a lot of you, having to deliver training and assessment online has been one of those things that you've been suddenly sort of forced into, or it's been something you've been doing for ages. But it's with such a new emphasis on assessment online, we really wanted to make sure you had some tips and tricks on how to make it the best. And finally, we had a chapter on assessment, an interview on assessment in the workplace, and really working with employers and students to making sure that you're getting the best out of, you can get the best out of your training systems. And finally, the last week was about the guide to developing assessment tools. This was a re-release of a document we'd published before, but it had been updated using advice from peers, so for example, people in the stakeholder liaison group, to make sure it was more relevant, current, and used the right terminology. We hope this is something you'll find really useful to use, and we're always interested in your experience with our tools. So if you do have feedback on a tool like this, please always let us know. What I'll be moving on to now is talking about our panelists. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Gayatri. Gayatri is from ASQA and will be here to help answer some of the questions regarding our regulation. Gayatri, if you'd like to say hello and introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Courtney. Welcome, everyone, to this particular webinar. My name is Gayatri Mahesh, and I'm a Director of Quality Assessment with ASQA. I've been with ASQA pretty much close to its inception, and I've been working in vet and higher education for over 15 years. And I hope we have a very enjoyable session, and I welcome the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Gayatri. And now I'll just cross to Gabrielle, who'd like to introduce herself. And also, if you'd like to give us a bit of advice on your interest in the sector.
Thanks, Courtney. Hi, everybody. I'm Gabrielle, or Gabby. I'm the Executive Officer at Ertoa and also a consultant to enterprise and sort of other RTOs within the industry. And the reason I'm here is that a lot of, when I go into RTOs, what I see is a really strong desire to get assessment tools right, and that assessment tools are being developed primarily not by trainers and assessors, but by learning and development people who aren't quite understanding how to unpack the tools and take advantage of workplace documentation to meet the requirements of the units of competency they're trying to assess.
That's fantastic, thank you. And finally, our final panelist is one of those interviewees. We'd like to welcome Paul.
Hey, everybody. Hi, thanks very much. And it's a real honor to join with you all today. And I've been a participant in almost all of these sessions with ASQA, and so it's a real pleasure to be here today and joining with you as one of the panelists. I come to you as a peer. Mostly my interest has been in TAE and formerly TAA. So over the years, I've had the privilege of getting a glimpse into so many different industries and how they go about developing their assessment tools and their training and assessment strategies. And it's given me a really unique and interesting insight. And I suppose one of the highlights for me has been, despite all the challenges of the last 18 months or so, is seeing the innovation and the way that people and RTOs have adapted to the challenges using technology. So that's of particular interest to me recently. But by and large, I've just seen so many really awesome approaches to quality assessment tool development across a huge range of industries. So really happy to be sharing with you all today, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. Now, before I just wanted to thank the panel, I just wanted to get on to, I've noticed a few questions about the Slido code not showing. My apologies, there was a slight technical problem on my end and the PowerPoint wasn't quite working, so you'll see the Slido code again now. Thank you for your patience, everyone. But moving back on, as we can see, our panel is here to provide some advice on both development, implementation of assessment tools and systems, and really give some great advice on the experience that they've got. Yeah, thank you. So, okay, now we're going to get into the all fantastic questions and answers. Thank you to everyone who's asked a question so far. And for those of you who now I hope have the Slido code. So, okay, now the very first question, one question I wanted to ask before we get into this is, Gabby, we've spoken a little bit about the use of verbs in the assessment and how you find the understanding how they're used is really important. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, sure, Courtney. Probably what I see the most when I'm looking at how assessment tools are developed is that when you look at performance criteria and performance evidence, the verbs in there are often really verbs that needs to be demonstrated. So if somebody's asking to implement or report, I want to be seeing something where they are implementing what needs to be implemented or reporting on it. So the tendency is that people will say, if you were going to implement this process, how would you do it? So there's a lot of talking about how things would be done instead of doing how they would be done. So one of the benefits of being an enterprise RTO is that you can conduct workplace assessments. So for example, a performance criteria, which is pretty common across a lot of units, is identify hazards, manage hazards, and report. So instead of asking a question on how would you do that, in the workplace, you could just use a risk assessment or a Take 5 that's used in the real work environment, and that meets all the requirements. So it's really about understanding which verbs can be turned into questions, and of those there are very few. It might be identify or it might be discuss, but most of the other verbs require a physical demonstration of skills to be deemed competent.
That's great, thank you. I think that's really clear. And now I'll just also cross to Paul and give him a question that one I'd seen come up on Slido is, can you talk a bit about the benefits of working with industry when you're developing and conducting assessment? I know you touched on it in your interview and it's really great, so.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, that's a good question. Industry is who we're here to serve as RTOs, as training providers. So I think regardless of what you're doing, a strong industry connection is super important. And what I've found to be particularly useful and quite successful in an industry engagement strategy is, I guess, moving away from having these big days or weeks where you try and cram all of your industry consultation in one hit, but build connections and relationships with industry and make that a regular thing. And we have the tools now, you know, everybody's so used to jumping on a Zoom call. So you now have the ability to really easily connect with industry professionals from all over the country and even other parts of the world as well. And have, I guess, ongoing industry connections. So it could be even just a 10-minute interview can really gain so much intelligence of what's happening in the real world. can easily be recorded if you're doing, you know, like a Zoom or a Teams meeting. And so I've found that ongoing connection really powerful. And it's not just for the benefit of developing really good assessment tools that are truly fit for purpose and really reflect the industry needs, but it's also really great business practice if you're running a private RTO, and strengthens the connection for your graduates, the legitimacy of what you do as an RTO. So there's so many wins to be had from connecting on that ongoing basis and fostering those connections.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's really great. Now we talked a bit about online, and one of the questions we received from Amanda, thanks Amanda, is, so this is really for the panel in general, but probably start with you, Paul. What are the best methods that you found for ensuring authenticity when delivering online?
Yep, authenticity is a massive challenge for anyone who's involved in the online space. And we've experienced challenges of our own there when you're authenticating who is actually at the other end. I think the biggest thing for us in our experience is building a strong relationship with the client. Now, I guess I speak from the experience of running longer programs like, you know, certificate 4 and diploma level programs, where you get to build a relationship with your clients, with your students over the period of the course. And so it's that in itself is a really powerful way to understand who's at the other end. And when you build that relationship, I know when I talk with our assessors, we genuinely feel confident in who we're working with, because we're doing so many interviews. You know, interviews are a really powerful assessment method because you get to meet face to face and ask about, it's not just observing their skills in action, but why did you do that, and why did you use that technique or choose that particular tool or piece of equipment. And so in building that relationship, there's definitely a lot of certainty about who's involved. Then there are, of course, it's good to get some legal advice as well on other authentication methods, like you can use statutory declarations or other kinds of declarations where the learner, it puts a legal onus on the learner to declare that it was indeed all their own work. And there's also other third-party services out there now that can assist with verifying identity. And so a quick Google search will reveal tons of different organizations that do that sort of thing. So they'll, similar to when you sign up to a utility, you know, they'll get the license number, and you know, you can start to cross-reference things with when you verify a USI, for example. So when you start to, in the same way that an assessor gathers evidence, you can kind of build into your practices this approach where you're getting the legal side of things, you've got the paperwork side of things, you might have other techniques such as getting people on camera just to do a quick introduction and hold up their photo ID, and then building a relationship with the client along the way. And then you've got such a solid suite of evidence there to really be sure of who you're working with. And that is so important. I think it's a terrible thing to issue a qualification and suddenly find out that, oh gosh, you know, maybe that wasn't the person that we trained and assessed. So that's a really great and a very important thing to keep in mind as we continue to hurdle into the online world for training and assessment.
Thanks. And actually, we've got another question from Amanda here, which is also a great question. And I'm going to throw this one across to Gabby. Gabby, can we assess all knowledge evidence implicitly through doing practical assessment?
Absolutely. And I think the more the better. So the skill, if there's a knowledge thing, going back to that risk assessment one that I was looking at that says, you know, knows how to do these, if they've demonstrated the skill, then the knowledge is ticked off.
Gayatri, do we have a regulatory thought about that?
I mean, there's no hard and fast regulatory policy that we have around it, but I agree. I mean, if the individual, the learner, can demonstrate the actual practical aspects, one would assume that they've got enough of the knowledge base to then demonstrate that through the practical component.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'll say people are nervous about it. There's an old thing of you need something for every performance criteria and every knowledge element. So people are a bit scared of it, but I think if you've got good demonstration of skills, then it's a much better outcome than asking a question about how you do something.
All right, now this is a question, and it actually might go to a few of the different panels, is are you required to map foundation skills if those are embedded in the performance criteria? Does anyone have a particular thought on that?
I'm going to say my thought is no.
Mhm.
If they're aligned, as long as you can show real demonstration of skills, then they're implicitly embedded.
Excellent, thank you. All right, and one question that's come up, and Paul, this is probably a good one for you, is how many times should I offer a student an opportunity to be reassessed? Is there a limit?
Well, I'm certainly not familiar of any official limits or rules around that. So it comes down to the RTO's policies and processes and a thoughtful consideration of your target audience, who the learners are, and the risks around the competency. So I think there needs to be some common sense too. You can't have learners hanging around forever, and they're also, when you get into that territory where gee, you know, so many of our learners are struggling to demonstrate competency, maybe it's important to go back and ask some why questions to find out what might be at the root cause of that. And you can trace those sorts of things right back to recruitment. And perhaps it's you're not getting the right information out there to students on enrolment, and you're getting the wrong people in the course that aren't properly equipped to do it, and that could account for lots of not yet competence, or it could be in the way that the training is being conducted. Perhaps students are not being given enough opportunity for practice and that formative assessment. Because hopefully when you get to that point of actually doing a proper competency-based assessment, you know, the summative assessment, you want to be at the stage where the student is fairly confident and the assessor is confident that they're getting towards that ability to do it. So a really common one I see is a rule of thumb of 3. So they have 3 attempts, and fairness comes at the principle of fairness under the 4 principles of assessment comes into this, I believe. But often when you see these rules of 3 attempts, you know, the 4th one is, well, we'll discuss your options and see what else is available from there. So a good thing, having consideration for your RTO's policies and procedures is really important there.
Excellent, thank you so much. And following on from that question we had earlier regarding can you assess knowledge evidence and performance evidence at the same time? Someone's asked if knowledge evidence can be sufficiently assessed just through the use of knowledge questions, or would we want other forms of evidence? Gayatri, do you have an opinion on that? Oh, sorry, Gabby? Yep, go.
Yeah, look, I was going to say there's often left over once you've mapped the knowledge to what you've demonstrated practically, there are often knowledge elements that are left over. My practice is then to create questions to meet that knowledge, and only one question for each knowledge requirement. If it happens to cover more than one, then fine, I map it to 2 places, or however many places it maps to.
And I think that's the position we'd support, isn't it, Gayatri?
Yes, that would be my response as well. I would agree with Gabby.
Thanks. Okay. Next question we've got is about, well, one thing that's actually, I'm just going to quickly raise myself, is that one question was about industry wanting changes to assessment because practice might not quite fit how industry is going, but the unit of competency requires a different assessment. I just wanted to point out, this is one of those situations where ASQA is the regulator of the training package, but unfortunately we do not have a lot of control over what content is in the training package, or in the sense that we are just a stakeholder into the content like you guys are. So feedback like that, it's really useful to you to feedback to the industry. It's really useful for you to feedback to your skilled services organisations and really influence the changes to training packages if you feel that they're needed. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. I just wanted to say, one of the questions we've got is, what's a suggested and acceptable approach to assessing observable skills during times when access to workplaces are either real, simulated, or restricted, or not available at all due to COVID-19? Which I'm sure is a problem that's hit a lot of our training providers. So Gayatri, I'll start with you from a regulatory perspective. Do you want to have a talk about sort of our flexibility?
I mean, during these difficult times, we have to be quite flexible in how we approach these things. But as you stated, there has to be some method in which the RTO works with the student to somehow observe and demonstrate the skill. We've also, it's a difficult one because it also depends on the industry area and the type of skill that they need to demonstrate. So I think we need to be flexible. We need to work around the specific skill that they need to demonstrate. And as long as the provider and the student can somehow work together to meet the requirements of that particular unit of competency, we would be fair and reasonable in accepting that as a means.
And I guess it's one of those things where, again, we are sort of a bit bound by what the training package requires. So if the training package has very specific details, we unfortunately can be a bit bound by them. So yeah. I might throw to Gabby at this point, because I think Gabby might have some thoughts on how to sort of see that from the training organisation perspective of what kind of adjustments you could make.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to say a lot of ATOA members have hit this problem. A lot of them are also essential workers, so the assessments have had to continue and we've had to work out ways to do it. Each member's worked out different ways. So some examples are, so in a retail environment, for example, the assessors are not allowed in the store, so they have somebody walking around filming, or like with an iPad and a live stream, and the assessor is still giving the instructions and the student is still performing the tasks, but they're seeing it via a link. Others have just been doing COVID safe, reducing class numbers, reducing assessor or increasing assessor numbers, spreading people out. So I think for a lot of the training, that's been able to go online as much as possible and be Zoomy kind of things. But a lot of our assessment has still had to happen with the demonstration of skills. So it's really a how do you capture those skills.
Thank you. And Paul, I'm going to cross to you with a different question. We've had a question about when you have students who have some learning difficulties, what reasonable adjustment can you provide without compromising the assessment process? And just before we get into that, going back to what you were saying earlier about the students that you select at the start, the students that, as you recruit them, that's the sort of thing that you'd be like looking through at that stage, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that is part of it. And when you are assisting a learner with a particular need, there needs to be plenty of consultation involved. Often learners who do come in with learning difficulties, I mean, they've lived with that all of their life and often have a bunch of strategies already that they can offer to the trainer and to the assessor to assist in an adjustment that is appropriate. At the end of the day, no, we can't compromise the integrity of the unit of competency, but there's some really creative and interesting ways that you can go about doing that. And it's a very broad question because learning difficulties arise out of all sorts of circumstances and backgrounds and other sorts of difficulties. And so it really does need to be done on a case-by-case basis, unless of course you're working with a cohort where there is a large prevalence of a learning difficulty that might be there. And the other source of information too is to go to experts. There are so many really amazing organisations in Australia that can assist with certain learning difficulties and particular needs. So I think consultation is the key, getting an understanding of what the situation is and what the best adjustment is in that case. And finally, the validation is really important. And not necessarily in the official validation sense from the standards, but when you are making an adjustment to an assessment, having a peer to come in and review what you're planning on doing and going, is this going to compromise the integrity of the standard of the unit of competency, and having someone peer review that and go, no, that's going to work. That can be really helpful as well.
That's great. Thank you. And following on from that, we've got a question that I will answer about, is it compulsory for RTOs to assess a learner's literacy and numeracy before enrolling them? And I'm going to answer that question by saying, please look out for our next Spotlight On series, which I'll get to in a couple of slides time, because that's actually one of the exact things that we'll be touching on in that series. So sorry, not an immediate answer, but you will be getting an answer very soon. In relation, so another question we've got is, if I have the same unit in a Certificate 4 course and in a diploma course, same industry area such as marketing, can I use the same assessment tool, or do I have to contextualise for the AQF level? Paul, would you like to answer that one?
Sure. That one's a tough one. I think at the end of the day, you've got a unit of competency, and there's a lot of contention. You'll see a range of different opinions on whether the AQF level applies to units of competency. I think at the end of the day, a unit of competency is assessed as it is. So my perspective on it is that if it's totally relevant to the context, like the question was asked in the context of marketing, and the case studies and the instructions around that apply, then I don't see an issue with that. And I might refer to my other panel colleagues for any further addition on that one.
No, that's good. I was just going to say, and I think I'll cross to Gabby in a second, but I just wanted to say on that too, I think perhaps one thing to consider is, in this situation, we're talking about the same industry, but a lot of units, of course, as we know, are spread across many different industries. And so I guess one thing that, as I said before I cross to Gabby, is the difference in the actual use of the context for the industry may affect as well how the unit competency should be assessed. Would you agree with that, Gabby?
Yeah, I would, but I would also say within the same industry, and I'm going to go back to what I said in the beginning, it depends what the verbs are. So at Cert 4 and Diploma, you'd be expecting to hear manage at Cert 4 and implement at Diploma. So if the unit was a Cert 4 unit and you were managing at Diploma level, then what would the job role require of that person to manage? So it might actually change the inflection of the verb a little bit, and that should be considered. In even same industries but multiple RTOs that I've worked with, a lot of units of competency are assessed completely differently based on the environments that they have to do the assessment. So the PUA training package is a really good example of that. If you use it in the electrical industry, it's very different to using it in the fire industry. So I think really just focus on the verbs. And I think Paul's right. I think they can be the same, but sometimes they need to be different.
Thank you. Gayatri, have you got an opinion from the regulatory position?
This is a tricky one, but yes, I do agree. I think a unit of competency is a unit of competency, and we're looking at this within the marketing industry. I do think it is on a case-by-case basis. I think we can look at best practice, and best practice would be to contextualize it according to the AQF level. That would be the ideal if we were looking at best practice. But if we're looking at a unit-by-unit basis, I think as long as it meets the requirements of that particular unit, it could fit for both a Cert 4 as well as for a diploma.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now, Gayatri, I'll ask you a probably a more gentle question that's less tricky. Does ASQA expect to see a mapping tool when we're assessing against 1.8? So a tool that maps between the performance evidence, the performance criteria, and the actual assessment tools, or is that something mandatory for us to see?
There's no mandatory requirement for a mapping tool, certainly not by ASQA. It's a great tool to use because it is a great way to lay out how the assessments map to the particular unit of competency, etc. Now it's up to the RTO or the provider to somehow showcase how the assessment tools map to the relevant unit of competency, the criteria, the performance criteria, etc. So whilst there's no requirement for an actual mapping tool, it's a useful way to demonstrate this. But if the provider or the RTO has a different means to do this, it'd be great to see that from our perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And the next question I'm looking at is there a required number of assessments per units of competency? Is one assessment per unit sufficient? Gabby, I might cross to you for this one.
Sure. It depends entirely on the unit. I think a lot of organisations have templates of this is how our assessment's going to work, and we're going to have a theory assessment and a practical assessment and a third-party report. And the reality is that doesn't work for all units of competency. So you need to understand what the requirement is of the skills to be demonstrated, and then how best to capture that and adjust accordingly. So it might be that you have to do role plays of things that are too dangerous to assess in a workplace environment, for example. So it really comes down to what it looks like. And my advice there would be, if you've got templates, understand that you don't have to fill out every section.
Mm-hmm. All right, you, Paul, do you find there's a particular sort of structure for how you structure how many assessments you do for a unit?
No, I really believe in considering precisely what the unit is all about. And consulting, I think that if you're designing an assessment tool from scratch, the first port of call after you've got an understanding of the application and the overall title, I think even the title of the unit of competency gives you a big clue on what's going on. And the verb there, Gabby. But I think the first port of call for designing assessment tools is looking at the performance evidence section, because that will tell you how many times a certain thing needs to be done and what sort of products need to be produced or what sort of things the student needs to do. And then, of course, the conditions of assessment give you really specific guidance. So I think being just guided from there and going from there, it's great to have lots of templates to draw on, but if you really tailor it to the unit, you don't lock yourself into that kind of tired process of the theory and then the practical, and you can come up with really innovative ways of doing it.
And a question we've also got here is, when assessments are purchased and are developed in the context of the training organisation, do we still need to contextualise it? So my thought would be it would very much involve learner cohorts and things like that. But Gabby, would you like to?
I'm going to say I've never seen a set of purchased assessment tools that are compliant. Like, they always need to be contextualized to where you are, and I think they always need a lot of work. I haven't seen anything that you can get and just go, oh yeah, wow, that's fantastic, and implement it.
It really tailors it to the training organisation and the students, and that sort of is important. I suppose in the industry, I suppose is really important.
Yeah.
Gayatri, do you have any thoughts on the use of purchase tools?
The purchase tools are a great starting point. I think they are a great foundation for the organization to then contextualize based on the requirements of the learners, the job outcomes, the mode of delivery. So there's a lot of things to consider once you've got the purchase tools to ensure that it meets the needs of the particular learner cohort.
Yeah. Now, a question that we've answered, and I think this very much comes into Gabby's verbs, is can performance criteria be completed through asking the candidate how they would complete a task, or must it be demonstrated? And I would say that's a perfect example of the use of the verbs. You'd agree with that, Gabby?
Absolutely. I've got quite a distaste for verbal questions because they're inconsistent and therefore can't really be mapped. But asking the example I will give is teaching your 16-year-old how to drive, and you say to your 16-year-old, sweetheart, do you know what you're doing? And they're like, oh my God, absolutely, I'm absolutely fine. And you put them in the car and they almost crash it as they pull away from the curb. That's the difference between tell me how you would do something to demonstrate how you do it.
I would consider the Dunning-Kruger effect on that too. Do some research onto that one if you want to see that very thing in action.
Now a question about written assessments, which I'll cross to Paul. Paul, do you have a theory on what the best method for providing assessors with marking guidance is for assessments? So someone suggested using a marking schema, sample answers, what would be minimum requirements? Does it depend on the tool itself?
Yes, it depends on the tool and the subject matter, the, what AQF level the unit of competency might, what qualification it might come from, if it, and that the wording of the questions. So just to give you a couple of examples of what I've seen work quite well, the rubric is really a really good tool because you can use that as long as it's not too fuzzy. If it's a really clear rubric, it's a really great way of identifying the key concepts that the assessor is looking for from the question. It might give students a little bit of room for creativity on how they might word it or craft their answer. So rubrics are good. And marking guides are excellent as well. But when you do marking guides, it's just so important to remember the old SMART principle. At the very least, be very specific in what you're looking for. So if you're needing the student to do, give 3 examples of something, make sure that the marking guide does specifically say that they must have 3 things. And of course that the assessors are complying with that. So very, very clear instructions for the assessors and very clear wording in any kind of rubric or marking guide is important there.
Thanks. Now, something that's again, I think we've covered slightly, but can one task be used for 2 assessment tools? For example, can a meeting be used to provide evidence to working with people and communicate at work from the business package?
Yeah.
So can you use a tool to pick up multiple units of competency? I think we'd all agree.
Multiple components and sometimes units, as long as the units are in the same context. Absolutely. That's the whole purpose of doing them holistically.
Yep, I'd agree with that.
Agreed.
And I've seen it done really well, and it often creates a more realistic environment for the assessment to take place and gives the students a sense of achievement that, hey, as part of doing this, it might seem like a big job, but you're actually demonstrating requirements against a range of units for your course, which is a good thing.
And
it's maintaining that balance as well. Yeah, it's maintaining a balance. I mean, if it could address both, why create an extra assessment just for the sake of it, as long as it's addressing what's required and the student's able to demonstrate that, then I would agree.
And following on from the assessment tools, we've had a question regarding, can multiple training organisations use the same assessment tool? And I would suggest, from what Gabby said earlier, that would be an issue. There could be an issue with that because of the students, like for example, the context in which the training organisations are operating in. If they're operating in different contexts, the assessment tools would not necessarily follow the same, be as useful. Would you agree, Gabby?
Yeah, so you've got context, but you've also got the learner cohort as well, what their exposure is, all sorts of other things. So I would say, like work cover, for example, we've got some compulsory assessment tools that then link to licensing that have some units, and people find it very, very difficult because they're not meaningful to the learner cohort that they're assessing.
And a question we've also got is, are there rules for clustering units when it comes to assessments? We've talked a bit about how the ASQA and obviously yourselves as peers support holistic assessments. So Gayatri, would you like to answer about clustering units in assessment?
There's no specific rules around clustering units for assessment. I think it's, again, thinking through how the holistic assessment will address the requirements of what's being clustered together. Is it meeting the objectives of, or the job outcomes? Is it meeting the objectives of what we're trying to assess? It depends on the industry area. It depends on, so a range of different variables need to be taken into consideration. And as long as the holistic assessment can address all of those, and the learner is actually walking away and can demonstrate the range of skill and knowledge, I think that's really a good outcome.
Paul, do you have, I assume that things like holistic assessment would go through what you do. How do you find managing holistic assessment when it comes to multiple training?
Yeah, I think the if the training package has it within the companion volume or companion guide, sometimes they provide really great information in there about clustering. Sometimes certain units of competency will give information on clustering as well. And an old friend of mine used the analogy of mixing paint colors together when it comes to clustering. There's this temptation when you see a whole bunch of units that are relevant to each other to try and, you know, cluster 3, 4 or 5 units together. And you know, it's nice when you mix, say, blue and yellow and get a nice green, but if you try and mix all the paints together, you end up with a murky brown color. So trying to keep it very relevant and similar and not, I guess, over cluster is important. Yeah.
Well, one question we've got here is actually about, as a trainer and assessor, do you have an opinion on due dates? Are they needed for specific assessment tasks, or should we allow students to submit work at their own pace, staying within the assessment plan guidelines? There is no obviously specific instruction from the ASQA perspective or the training package perspective regarding timeframes on due dates. There's timeframes obviously in terms of how many times you must do things, but in terms of due dates, that's not a mandatory thing from our perspective. So as a training organisation, do you have a comfort with due dates?
We've experimented with both types, especially when it comes to more of a self-paced kind of program, and we've found that having due dates in there, or at the very least when we use individualized learning plans with due dates, so the due dates are individualized to the student based on an initial meeting and consultation with them, that can be a really powerful motivator. And I think, you know, we try and be flexible with them. I think just kicking a student out because they haven't precisely met a due date is probably not the best approach, but it's a really great motivator, and it can really help students stay on track with the work that they're doing, and so that it doesn't all pile up towards the end. So they have been quite useful in terms of boosting completion in those more self-paced kind of programs. But yeah, again, there's nothing in there that says, you know, we have to do it or we should not do it. And I think at the end of the day, you can't have students hanging around forever, and it's probably good to have some way of motivating students towards some kind of finish line so they can really get a feel for what volume of work is in there and what they might need to do and by when. So it's a good organisational tool, I'll give you that.
Excellent. Now we're sort of in the last 10 minutes. So there's actually a couple of questions that have come through regarding simulated environments, especially again in COVID times, but also just simulated environments. And so I thought I'd actually ask all three of you for a comment on what you find is important when designing a simulated assessment environment, but also what makes it work. So I'll start with you, Gabby.
Okay, thank you. The simulated environment needs to simulate the same kind of conditions as the workplace. So, for example, in a train, like a rail safety environment, some of the government organisations have fake train tracks built so that people can be next to the tracks in the rail safety corridor and perform their assessment there. And there you've got a difference between, am I looking at it and walking along the flat path beside it, or am I putting people on the tracks so they've got to walk over the rough stones and see how they can do it? So I think even if you've got the live environment, you need to be pushing people to experience as much as possible the same experience that they would be in the workplace. So pressure, so if it's noise, that you'd have some noise in the background. If it's a time thing, which kind of relates to the previous question, I've had questions about, can I deem somebody not yet competent because they haven't completed the task in the time we allowed them? And the time is a business requirement, it's a business standard that they complete something within a certain time. And the answer is, no, you can't. They're still demonstrating the skills. They might have taken 2 minutes more. So you then need to have policies and procedures around, in the workplace, what's our expectation, so that people understand that it has to be done in a certain time frame to be considered applicable to the workplace.
Thanks. Paul, I'll ask for your opinion on simulated environments and how to make them perfect. Not perfect, that's a little bit too much to expect from everyone. So just in terms of making them.
Oh, no, that I think what Gabby said is really valid, and any kind of simulation, especially in any kind of high risk industry, needs to be pretty spot on. And I recall an experience working with one of our clients at the Navy with the Seahawk helicopters, and my little gift at the end was to have a play in the simulator. And I can't fly a helicopter, that's for sure. And this machine, the simulator is so advanced, and the experience of being in it was absolutely terrifying, especially as I started falling from the sky. And that the effort and technology that went into simulating that to make it just like the real conditions of an aircraft were so advanced. Now that's a very specific example, but you could also look at if anyone's ever seen how they do the underwater escape competencies, where they put you in a pool and they flip over a device which is meant to simulate being in a helicopter or an aircraft in the ocean and having to escape and get your seatbelt off. And it's terrifying, and it's full on, and you get water up your nose, and it's really serious simulation that does simulate the real, what it would be like in the real environments. So simulation is awesome. Use with caution. I think it's you've got to be careful when you get into the realms of making simulation something where it's like a make-believe, or pretend you're in this environment, or using a case study as the basis of a simulation. It can help to a certain degree in training and building certain skills and building certain knowledge, but when it comes down to it, yeah, you really need to see students demonstrating their skills in some kind of environment that's as realistic as possible. Because when they get out there in the real world and experience that thing for real, and if you haven't equipped them for that, it's not a good situation to be in.
Excellent, thank you. And finally, we'll just go to Gayatri for, again, the regulatory sort of perspective.
I mean, Gabby and Paul have done an excellent job in kind of defining what a simulated environment. It should be as close to a real situation as possible. And, they should not feel a lack that they have not actually gone through what that real life scenario would have been, except for the fact that it's called a simulated environment. I think that's the way I would phrase it. It's not a make-believe, it's not a imagine you are, as you said, Paul. It is, you are in this situation, you are in this environment, and you need to manage it accordingly. Of course, depending on the context, the industry area, so on and so forth. So as real as possible is the simplest way I can put it.
Mm-hmm. And again, using that training package as a guide, I think we'd all agree
Absolutely.
It gives you a lot of details on what you need to do. All right, well, that's actually the end of our question and answer section. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of our panel for answering those questions. I'd also like to thank everyone who submitted questions. I do apologise that we weren't able to get through everyone's questions. As I've noticed, there are a few questions come up, and I've already seen how we can think about providing some extra education on those or updates on them in other formats. So thank you. They said that everything you've asked is valuable and we will look at it. I really wanted to thank the panel for being involved. Your expertise has been so useful. I'm sure a lot of people have got some really valuable evidence out of it. I thank you all for your contribution. And for those people who I mentioned, if you have ideas for topics, this is the way to get it through to us. We've got our website, which has, you can email our inquiries line. Again, if you feel that there's a question today that was specific to your industry or specific to your training organisation, or one that you just felt you wanted some more information on, you can certainly email us via inquiries@asqa.gov.au. You can sign up for our LinkedIn. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter, which comes through our main page. Doing that, we'll also, in each monthly newsletter, we try and put some tips and cover a little bit some of the stuff that Spotlight didn't get a chance to cover. So finally, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I'd like to again say a very special thanks to the panel. We'll be sending out a very short survey at the end, so please don't hang up too quickly because you'll get a chance to fill in a survey. Your thoughts really let us understand what you guys as our clients need. We're really looking forward to hearing from you talk about how this webinar went, what you can learn from other webinars, and what topics interest you in the future. And as noted, this session is being recorded. So if anyone wants to watch this later, or your colleagues want to watch this later, it will be available on our website in the next few days. Thanks once again to everyone who came. Thanks again to the panel. Thanks again to everyone who attended. Thanks to those who submitted questions. I hope you all have a really fabulous day.